around Israel and Gaza that are crossing over into anti-Semitism, rank anti-Semitism, with Jewish people simply being targeted for being Jewish, having nothing to do with Israel. I want to explain through the lens of history why this is so dangerous. The normalization and exacerbation of this rise in hate is the danger many Jewish people fear most. And finally, I want to suggest how and why I hope that all Americans of goodwill can come together and do a better job of condemning such views and such behavior. But first, let us establish the facts. There's no question that anti-Semitism is a serious problem in America. In general, Jewish Americans represent 2% of the U.S. population. Yet, we are the targets of 55% of all religion-based hate crimes recorded by the FBI. This problem has been steadily worsening in recent years. But after Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, hate crimes against Jewish Americans have skyrocketed. The Anti-Defamation League estimates that anti-Semitic incidents have increased nearly 300% since October 7th. The NYPD has recorded a 214% increase in New York City. And after October 7th, Jewish Americans are feeling singled out, targeted, and isolated. In many ways, we feel alone. The solidarity that Jewish Americans initially received from many of our fellow citizens was quickly drowned out by other voices, while the dead bodies of Jewish Israelis were still warm, while hundreds of Jewish Israelis were being carried as hostages back to Hamas tunnels under Gaza. Jewish Americans were alarmed to see some of our fellow citizens characterize a brutal terrorist attack as justified because of the actions of the Israeli government. A vicious, blood-curdling, premeditated massacre of innocent women, men, children, the elderly, justified. Even worse, in some cases, people even celebrated what happened, describing it as the deserved fate of, quote, colonizers, and calling for glory to the martyrs who carried out these heinous attacks. That happened here in America. Many of the people who express these sentiments in America aren't neo-Nazis or card-carrying Klan members or Islamist extremists. They're in many cases people that most liberal Jewish Americans felt previously were their ideological fellow travelers. Not long ago, many of us marched together for black and brown lives. We stood against anti-Asian hatred. We protested bigotry against the LGBTQ community. We fought for reproductive justice out of the recognition that injustice against one oppressed group is injustice against all. But apparently, Mr. President, in the eyes of some, this principle does not extend to the Jewish people. The largely Ashkenazi survivors of decades of pogroms in Imperial Russia and the Holocaust under Nazi Germany, their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, the Mizrahi, who were forcibly evicted from Arab countries, and their descendants, the many Sephardim, who were scattered across the Mediterranean after they were expelled from Spain and Portugal in the late 1400s. Do they not deserve the solidarity of those who advocate for the rights and dignity of the oppressed, given the long history of persecution of the Jewish people throughout the world? Many of those protesting Israeli policy note that at least 700,000 Palestinians displaced or forced from their homes in 1948, but they never mention the 600,000 Mizrahi Jews across the Arab world who were also displaced, whose property was confiscated, whose lives were threatened, who were expelled from their communities. The hope at the time was that there would be two states, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, living side by side. The plan was for the state of Israel to absorb the Jewish people from Arab lands and the new Palestinian state to absorb the Palestinians who now lived in Israel. In fact, Israel did absorb the displaced Jewish people of Arab lands. But the Arab nations instead sanctioned the United Nations to set up refugee camps for the Palestinians, refusing to accept the possibility that any of them would ever be relocated. Several times throughout history, Israeli prime ministers called for a return to close to the pre-1967 borders established by the United Nations plan. Those calls were rejected by Yasser Arafat, the PLO, and the wider Arab community. Many, if not most, Jewish Americans, including myself, support a two-state solution. We disagree with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his administration's encouragement of militant settlers in the West Bank, which has become a considerable obstacle to a two-state nation. But the reason why I invoke history about the founding of the Israeli state is because forgetting or even deliberately ignoring this vital context is dangerous. Some of the most extreme rhetoric against Israel has emboldened anti-Semites who are attacking Jewish people simply because they are Jewish, independent of anything having to do with Israel. And those who are inclined to examine the world through the lens of oppressors versus the oppressed should take note that the many thousands of years of Jewish history are defined by oppression. From October 7th, 2023 in southern Israel, to 2018 at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, to 1999 at the Los Angeles JCC, to 1986 at the Neve Shalom Synagogue in Istanbul, to 1974 at the Netev Meir Elementary School in Malot, to Yom Kippur, 1973 in the Golan Heights, to 1972 at the Munich Olympics and Lod Airport, to 1967 at the Straits of Tiran, to the 1940s and 30s in Germany and Central Europe, to the 1800s in the Pale of Settlement, to 1679 in Yemen, to 1492 in Spain, 1394 in France, to 1290 in England, to the Crusades in the Middle Ages, to 629 in Galilee, to the year 73 in Jerusalem, to 586 BC in Judea, to 722 BCE in Samaria, to the 13th century BCE in Egypt. The Jewish people have been humiliated, ostracized, expelled, enslaved, and massacred for millennia. To paraphrase lines recited every year, century after century at Passover Seder, this is the bread of affliction that our forefathers ate in the land of Egypt. In every generation, they rise up to destroy us. For Jewish people all across the world, the history of our trauma going back many generations is central to any discussion about our future. To many Americans, especially in our younger generation, too many Americans, especially in our younger generation, don't have a full understanding of this history, because some Jewish people have done well in America, because Israel has increased its power and territory. There are people who feel that Jewish Americans are not vulnerable, that we have the strength and security to overcome prejudice and bigotry, that we have, to quote the language of some, become the, quote, oppressors. In fact, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories throughout the generations often theorize, often weaponize this very dynamic by pitting what successes the Jewish people have achieved against them and against their fellow countrymen. That's been throughout history. It's happening now. But for many Jewish Americans, any strength and security that we enjoy always feels tenuous. No matter how well we're doing, it can all be taken away in an instant. That's just how it is. We only have to look back a century, a few generations, to see how this can happen. Growing up, I remember my grandfather telling me that he rooted for Germany over Russia in World War I because Germans treated the Jewish people so much better than Russia did. In the early 1900s, German Jews were one of the most secure and prosperous ethnic communities in Europe. But in the span of a decade, all of that changed. When the Nazis first marched in the streets and held rallies decrying the so-called international financiers, war profiteers, communists, many Germans of goodwill either stayed silent or marched alongside of them, not necessarily realizing what they were aiding and abetting. But when Adolf Hitler took the podium just a few years later at the Reichstag, it was clear by then that the terms international financiers, war profiteers, communists represented the Jewish people, who Hitler called parasites, feeding on the body and productive work of other nations. By bits and pieces, the Nazis softened the ground rhetorically for what Hitler eventually stated was his true goal, quote, the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. And so many of those Germans of goodwill who marched in the early years of Hitler's ascension stayed on the sidelines after his horrifying intent was made clear. The end result, as we all know, was the most targeted and systematic genocide in all of human history. 6 million Jewish people were exterminated in a few years, while so many others turned a blind eye. History shows that anti-Semitism is deeply embedded in Europe. I have always said it is the poison of European societies. Anti-Semitism is the poison of European societies, just as racism against Black Americans is the poison of our society. And while we're thankfully a far ways away from Nazi Germany today, this is why many people worry about the marches today, especially in Europe. What may begin as legitimate criticism of Israeli policy, or even a valid debate over other religious, economic, and political issues, can sometimes cross into something darker, attacking Jewish people for simply being Jewish. Obviously, many of those marching here in the U.S. do not have any evil intent. But when Jewish people hear chants like "From the river to the sea," a founding slogan of Hamas, a terrorist group that is not shy about their goal to eradicate the Jewish people in Israel and around the globe, we are alarmed. When we see signs in the crowd that read, "By any means necessary," after the most violent attack ever against Israeli civilians, we are appalled at the casual invocation of such savagery. When we see protesters at Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade compare the genocide of the Holocaust equivalently to the Israeli army's action to defeat Hamas in self-defense of their people, we are shocked. And when we see many people in news organizations remain neutral about the basic absurdity of these claims and actions, we are deeply disappointed. More than anything, we're worried, quite naturally, given the twists and turns of history, about where these actions and sentiments could eventually lead. Now, this is no intellectual exercise for us. For many Jewish people, it's like a matter of survival, informed once again by history. In this case, very personal history to me. Take the story of my own family. My grandfather came to Ellis Island at a very young age from Eastern Europe, without an education, without a penny to his name. He was a street urchin, stealing apples from the push carts just to survive. But he dreamt of a brighter future for himself and his family. My grandfather ended up with the paper workers in Utica, New York, and helped form the union there. But he lost his job in the lead up to World War II, so he came back to New York City and bought a little exterminating business. His son, my father, followed in his footsteps and eventually took over that exterminating business. My father struggled in that job, barely making ends meet. But together with my mom, he provided a stable and loving home in Brooklyn for my siblings and me, where we were able to flourish. And because of the tolerance and the openness and the opportunity that courses through all of American life, I now stand before you as the majority leader of the United States Senate, the highest elected office a Jewish person has ever attained in the history of this country. Only in America, could an exterminator's son grow up to be the first Jewish party leader in the Senate. But it must be said also, this is not the norm in the grand and long scheme of Jewish history. While my grandfather came to America and encountered opportunity, many of his siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles, and other family members remained behind in Eastern Europe. When I was still a young boy, I was told why many branches of our family tree stopped growing forever. In 1941, when the Nazis invaded Ukraine, then part of Galicia, they asked my great-grandmother, the matriarch of the family, the wife of a locally revered rabbi, to gather her children, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren on the porch of her home, which was located in the town square. As more than 30 people gathered on the porch, aged 85 to 3 months, the Nazis forced the remaining Jewish citizens of the town to gather in the town square and watch. When the Nazis told my great-grandmother, "You are coming with us," she refused. And they machine-gunned down every last one of them. The babies, the elderly, everybody in between. This story resonated deeply in my heart when I first started learning the details of the October 7th massacre in Israel. I was in China with a bipartisan delegation of my fellow senators, trying to get President Xi Jinping to open up Chinese markets to American companies and stop the flow of fentanyl across our borders. As the horrors of October 7th started coming into focus, the Israeli ambassador to China shared with me the story of what she heard had just happened in one of the kibbutzim called Be'eri. Hamas terrorists entered the kibbutz on October 7th and killed more than 120 Jewish residents, from the elderly to the babies. Sadly, it was not the first time I heard of such evil being committed against the Jewish people. Most, if not all, Jewish Americans know stories similar to that of my family. And most, if not all of us, learned this story at a young age. It will be imprinted in our hearts for as long as we live. All Jewish Americans carry in them the scar tissue of this generational trauma, and that directly informs how we are experiencing and processing the rhetoric of today. We see and hear things differently from others because we're deeply sensitive to the deprivation and horrors that can follow the targeting of Jewish people if it is not repudiated. Which brings me back to today. While many protesters, no doubt, view their actions as a compassionate expression of solidarity with the Palestinian people, for many Jewish Americans, we feel in too many instances, some of the most extreme rhetoric gives license to darker ideas that have always lurked below the surface of every question involving the Jewish people. Anti-Semites have always trafficked in coded language, and action to define Jewish people as unworthy of the rights and privileges afforded to other groups. I believe there are plenty of people who chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, not because they hate Jewish people, but because they support a better future for Palestinians. But there is no question that Hamas and other terrorist organizations have used this slogan to represent their intention to eliminate Jewish people, not only from Israel, but from every corner of the earth. Given the history of oppression, expulsion, and state violence that is practically embedded in Jewish DNA, can you blame the Jewish people for hearing a violently anti-Semitic message, loud and clear, anytime we hear that chant? We shouldn't accept this sort of language from anybody, any more than we accept other racist dog whistles, like invoking welfare queens to criticize safety net programs, or calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus. And that goes for extreme right-wing Jewish settlers who also use deplorable language and who don't believe there should be any Palestinians between the river and the sea. Anti-Semites are taking advantage of the pro-Palestinian movement to espouse hatred and bigotry towards Jewish people. But rather than call out this dangerous behavior for what it is, we see so many of our friends and fellow citizens, particularly young people who yearn for justice, unknowingly aiding and abetting their cause. And worse, many of our friends and allies whose support we need now more than ever during this moment of intense Jewish pain have brushed aside these concerns. Suddenly, they don't want to hear about anti-Semitism or the ultimate goal of Hamas. When I've asked some of the marchers what they would do about Hamas, they don't have an answer. Many don't seem to care. And so Jewish Americans are left alone, at least in our eyes, to ponder what this all means and where it could lead. Can you understand why the Jewish people feel isolated when we hear some praise Hamas and chant its vicious slogan? Can you blame us for feeling vulnerable only 80 years after Hitler wiped out half the Jewish population across the world, while so many countries turned their back? Can you appreciate the deep fear we have about what Hamas might do if left to their own devices? Because the long arc of Jewish history teaches us a lesson that is hard to forget. Ultimately, we are alone. As a teenager, growing halfway across the world from Israel in Brooklyn during the 50s and 60s, I remember this feeling of aloneness myself. When many of the world's airlines boycotted Israel so that they could maintain business with the Arab world, I admired Air France as a little boy because only they would fly to Israel. I preferred to drink Coca-Cola to Pepsi because Coca-Cola did business in Israel and refused to participate in a biased boycott. Later, I remember in June of 1967, walking in solitary silence to class in Madison High School with a transistor radio held to my ear, listening to the news reports about the Six-Day War and praying to God that Israel would survive. On top of feeling alone, the second dominant feeling that Jewish people have endured throughout history has been the sting of the double standard, which is the way the world has practiced anti-Semitism over and over again. To the Jewish people, the double standard has been ever present and is at the root of anti-Semitism. The double standard is very simple. What is good for everybody is never good for the Jew. And when it comes time to assign blame for some problem, the Jew is always the first target. And in recent decades, this double standard has manifested itself in the way much of the world treats Israel differently than anybody else. The double standard was made clear to me when I was in college. I remember the day when the great and articulate Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Abba Eban, was invited to come lecture on campus while the Students for Democratic Society and the Progressive Labor Party were waging a campaign against Israel's right to exist. 2,000 people gathered in a large auditorium to see Ambassador Eban, and the members of the SDS-PLP sat in the gallery and hung a banner saying, "Fight the Zionist imperialists." When the members of the SDS and the PLP tried to shout him down, Eban pointed his finger to the protesters in the gallery, and with his Etonian inflection, he calmly but strongly delivered a statement I will never forget, and that I will paraphrase to now. He said, "I am talking to you up there in the gallery. Every time a people gets their statehood, you applaud it. The Nigerians, the Pakistanis, the Zambians, you applaud their getting statehood. There is only one people, when they gain statehood, you don't applaud, you condemn it, and that is the Jewish people. We Jews are used to that," he said. "We have lived with a double standard throughout the centuries. There were always things the Jews couldn't do. Everyone could be a farmer, but not the Jew. Everyone could be a carpenter, but not the Jew," he said. "Everyone could move to Moscow, but not the Jew. And everyone can have their own state, but not the Jew." There is a word for it, he said to them. That is anti-Semitism, and I accuse you in the gallery of it. And the protesters slinked off. This double standard persists in America today, and it is once again leaving Jewish people feel isolated and alone. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, an attack on defenseless civilians, the elderly, women, babies, a good number of people skipped over expressing sympathy for its victims in their haste to blame the attack on the past actions of the Israeli government. Can anyone imagine a horrific terrorist attack in another country receiving such a reception? And when Hamas terrorists actively hide behind innocent Palestinians, knowing that many of those civilians will die in the Israeli response, why does the criticism for any civilian death seem to fall exclusively on Israel and not at all on Hamas? My heart breaks for the thousands of Palestinian civilians who have been killed or suffering in this conflict, so many children. And I have urged the Israeli government to minimize civilian casualties on many occasions. But by committing such heinous atrocities on October 7th, before sneaking back into their tunnels underneath hospitals and in refugee camps in Gaza, Hamas has knowingly invited an immense civilian toll during the war, exploiting the double standard that so much of the world applies to Israel. Of course, let me repeat, that does not relieve Israel of the responsibility to protect innocent Palestinian lives. And I've been among the first to tell Israeli leaders they must act according to international law. I'm also fighting for critical humanitarian aid for Palestinians that this Senate, under my leadership, is working to deliver. So, I rise in this chamber today. I am speaking up to issue a warning informed by lessons of history, too often forgotten. No matter what our beliefs, no matter where we stand on the war in Gaza, all of us must condemn anti-Semitism with full-throated clarity wherever we see it, before it metastasizes into something even worse. Because right now, that's what Jewish Americans fear most. The spike in anti-Semitism we're experiencing right now in America began after the worst instance of violence committed against Jewish people since the Holocaust. The vitriol against Israel in the wake of October 7th is all too often crossing a line into brazen and widespread anti-Semitism, the likes of which we haven't seen for generations in this country, if ever. Which is why we need to name it clearly anytime we see it. After October 7th, when boycotts were organized against Jewish businesses in Philadelphia that have nothing to do with Israel, that is anti-Semitism. After October 7th, when swastikas appeared on Jewish delis on the Upper East Side, that is anti-Semitism. After October 7th, when protesters in California shouted at Jewish Americans, "Hitler should have smashed you," that is anti-Semitism. After October 7th, when a Jewish U.S. senator was violently threatened for her views on Israel, that is anti-Semitism. After October 7th, when students on college campuses across the country who wear a yarmulke or display a Jewish star are harassed, verbally vilified, pushed, even spat upon and punched, that is anti-Semitism. After October 7th, when an author in a prominent left-wing magazine labeled the pro-Israeli rally in Washington a hate rally, that is anti-Semitism. I attended that rally, like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of others, because I believe there should be a place of refuge for the Jewish people, not because I wish violence on Palestinians or any other people. And Mr. President, after October 7th, when students at Hillcrest High School in Queens ran rampant in the hallways and demanded the firing of a teacher, these are high school students, demanding the firing of a teacher just because that teacher attended a rally supporting Israel, and forced her to hide in a locked office for hours while staff struggled to regain control, that is anti-Semitism. Walking out of the school to march in support of Palestinians is completely legitimate. But forcing a Jewish teacher to remain, as she described, locked in an office because she attended a rally in support for Israel is anti-Semitism, pure and simple. In fact, Mr. President, the teacher who I'm speaking about is sitting in the gallery today, right now. I invited her to come and listen, and I am truly honored that she accepted my invitation. That is true courage. I believe it shows just how strongly so many Jewish Americans feel about the issue. She has requested anonymity, which I ask everybody present and everyone in the media to please respect. But I say to her from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being here. Thank you for caring. I have just listed a few of the so many examples, there are so many more, of pure, unadulterated anti-Semitism has dramatically increased since October 7th. But the roots of pluralistic, multi-ethnic democracy are deep in America. This is a place where Jewish people have been able to flourish alongside so many other immigrant groups. We must never lose sight of just how special that is, nor must we ever stop fighting for it. All Americans share a responsibility and an obligation to fight back whenever we see the rise of prejudice of any type in our midst. To preserve this nation as a promised land of refuge, as a land that honors the dignity of every individual, as the land of opportunity for all. So my fervent plea to the American people of all creeds and backgrounds is this. First, learn the history of the Jewish people who have been abandoned repeatedly by their fellow countrymen. I say this particularly to younger people who didn't live with any of this history. Learn the history of the Jewish people who have been left isolated and alone to combat anti-Semitism through the centuries. Second, reject the illogical and anti-Semitic double standard that is once again being applied to the plight of Jewish victims and hostages, to some of the actions of the Israeli government, and even to the very existence of a Jewish state. That is a double standard. There's no ducking from it. Third, understand why Jewish people defend Israel, not because we wish harm on Palestinians, but because we fear a world where Israel is forced to tolerate the existence of groups like Hamas that want to wipe out all Jewish people from the planet. Some of us watch this film, which the public can't see, which show the brutality and viciousness that every Israeli citizen and every Jew feels. We fear a world where Israel, the place of refuge for Jewish people, will no longer exist. If there is no Israel, there will be no place for Jewish people to go when they are persecuted in other countries. As an adult, I remember watching my grandfather, one of the few in his family to survive the Holocaust, being overwhelmed by emotion and breaking down in tears when he saw Israel for the first time. This had nothing to do with politics or with money or with racism or with oppression. It was deeply human. The emotional catharsis of a man whose family was uprooted and exterminated, finally stepping foot in the place of refuge for his people, a place that the Jewish people had yearned for, not just for decades or centuries, but for millennia. So many of my aunts and uncles and cousins and nieces and nephews would be alive today had Israel existed before World War II, as I said before. Many Jewish Americans fear what the future may bring, based on the repeated lessons of history. Many Jewish Americans see clear anti-Semitism in the double standard that is being wielded by too many opponents of Israel. And we see it in attacks on Jewish people for simply being Jewish, apart from having anything to do with Israel. And maybe worst of all, many Jewish Americans feel alone to face all of this, abandoned by too many of our friends and allies in our greatest time of need, as anti-Semitic hate crimes skyrocket across the country. I implore every person, every community, every institution to stand with Jewish Americans, not to ignore it, not to shrug your shoulders, to denounce it, anti-Semitism in all its forms, especially the double standard that has been wielded against the Jewish people for generations to isolate us. The time for solidarity must be now. Nothing less than the future of the American experiment hangs in the balance. Building a more perfect union, one that fulfills our founding ideals, is our longest and most solemn struggle as a country. And as Americans, we are called on to do all we can to achieve that higher standard. We are stewards of the flames of liberty, tolerance, equality, that warm our American melting pot and make it possible for Jewish Americans to prosper alongside Palestinian Americans and every other immigrant group from all over the world. Are we a nation that can defy the regular course of human history, where the Jewish people have been ostracized, expelled, and massacred over and over again? I believe, truly believe in my heart, that the answer can and must be a resounding yes. And I will do everything in my power, as Senate Majority Leader, as a Jewish American, as a citizen of a free society, as a human being, to make it happen. Kain Yehi Ratzon. May it be God's will. I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the
Without
protocol be
objection.
dispensed with. I had an opportunity to watch the Majority Leader's speech this morning. It was extraordinary. I want to compliment him for providing a history lesson for Americans about the history of the Jewish people and putting it in context with the conflict that's underway. So I want to thank him and associate myself with his remarks. I share his disgust at the alarming rise of anti-Semitism in America and around the world in the wake of the October 7th attacks. So again, I stand with him in condemning this hatred, and I stand with our ally Israel as it defends, literally, its right to exist. On another subject, border security is actually national security. This is not just a statement of legislative priorities or partisan politics. It's a fact of human history. The Senate has little more than 2 weeks to deliver supplemental legislation on the 4 urgent national security priorities, and each one of them deals directly with the questions of border and sovereignty. For over a decade, Putin has been trying to redraw the borders of Europe. He's invaded and occupied Georgia and Ukraine. He's attempted assassinations and influence operations on foreign soil. And he's exploited humanitarian crises to weaponize migrant flows to Europe, including most recently at the border of Finland. Meanwhile, the Hamas terrorists who rule Gaza violated sovereign borders on their way to slaughtering 1,200 Israelis and taking hundreds more hostages. These savages stated objective is to erase the borders of the state of Israel, quote, from the river to the sea. China, for its part, is also keenly focused on challenging borders. The PRC has used force in an attempt to gain the upper hand along its border with India. It's expanded its military footprint in the South China Sea and threatened to resolve long-standing territorial disputes with multiple neighbors by force. And China's historic investments in military modernization are aimed at threatening Taiwan's sovereignty and bringing the island to heel. Borders matter. Sovereignty matters. The United States is a global superpower with global interests, and we have an interest in preventing autocrats and terrorists from trampling the borders of Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. Because if we leave them unchecked, these aggressors will keep challenging borders and keep starting wars. Borders are intrinsically and universally about a nation's security. Controlling and defending them is the essential predicate of sovereignty. So it's not by accident that in addressing urgent national security priorities, Senate Republicans are working so hard on policy changes to restore security to America's own borders. Trying to clean up the Biden administration border crisis isn't some arbitrary interest. That is, unless you ask the Democratic leader. According to the senior senator from New York, the national security crisis his party has abetted at the southern border is extraneous to the National Security Supplemental before the Senate. The way our colleague sees it, securing our own borders as we help our allies and partners defend their sovereignty would be dangerous. Dangerous? Here's the real world. What's dangerous is denying the humanitarian and national security crisis festering at America's southern border on President Biden's watch. What's dangerous is accepting the record numbers of illegal aliens surging across our borders as the new normal. What's dangerous is defending our open borders and a broken asylum and parole system, even at the risk of urgent assistance to our partners in Ukraine, Israel, and Asia. The Biden administration's open borders will rank among its biggest national security failures, plain and simple. But if Senate Democrats refuse to take border security policy changes seriously, they'll also be wrapping America's weakness up as a Christmas gift to Russia, China, and Iran. Borders are an essential element of national security. They are not extraneous. We must secure and defend sovereign borders, beginning right here at home. If we fail to uphold this basic fundamental responsibility, America and our friends around the world will pay dearly. Now, on another matter, President Biden is on the road today, and he's facing an uphill battle to convince the American people that Bidenomics is somehow working. For months, the president has been touring the country with a rosy assessment of the economy on his watch. He's been telling working Americans about what the administration's obsession with radical climate policy is doing for them. But by overwhelming margins, the American people haven't been buying what the president is selling. Polls continue to show that for millions of families, Bidenomics is just a code for higher prices, shrinking paychecks, and lower quality of life. The entire nation watched in real time as the Biden administration's war on domestic energy drove the price of gas and home heating through the roof. Taxpayers watched Washington Democrats turn their hard-earned dollars into subsidies for blue state liberal favorites, electric cars, and home appliances. Here's how one analysis put it, quote, "The typical American household must spend an additional $11,434 annually just to maintain the same standard of living they enjoyed in January of 2021. An extra $11,000 a year just to stay afloat." But the Biden administration's latest tactic appears to be publicly congratulating itself that prices on some everyday staples were actually rising slower than the record paces that were set during their time in office. The president himself has even wagged his finger at American growers, manufacturers, and retailers to, quote, "stop the price gouging now that inflation has come down." Well, the Bidenomics strategy apparently depends on working Americans ignoring the reality they live in every day. The White House seems to be counting on middle-class families to forget about the 40-year high inflation their spending binge helped create. They want the country to set aside that average food prices have risen 20% since President Biden took office. Well, it doesn't look like the American people have any intention of suspending their disbelief about Bidenomics. And who on earth would blame them?
Senator from New York.
I'm here once again to highlight the stories of the people who have been and continue to be held hostage by Hamas. I'm so happy to hear that several of our hostages whose families I've worked with have been finally returned. They include the 4-year-old Abigail Moore Idan, whose parents were both murdered in front of her eyes, and who now faces the horrible process of healing from the many traumas she underwent. Danielle Aloni and her 5-year-old daughter, Amelia. They had been visiting Danielle's sister, Sharon, her brother-in-law, David, and their 3-year-old twins, Emma and Julie, on the day of the attack, when all of them were taken captive. Sharon, Emma, and Julie have also just been released, but David still remains in captivity. I'm so grateful that members of another family I've worked with have also been released. They include 67-year-old mother, Shoshan, sister Adi, Adi's 2 young children, Neve and Yahel, Aunt Sharon, and Sharon's 12-year-old daughter, Noam. It has been heartening to see these families reunited with their loved ones, to see the joy and the indescribable relief, and I'm grateful to the Biden administration for making these reunions possible. But of course, many, many more people still remain in captivity, including Emma and Julie's father, David, and Neve and Yael's father, Tal. These families have already endured the worst traumas imaginable, and yet now they have still been ripped apart with no idea when they will see their fathers and brothers and sons again. Tal is a 38-year-old who reads a lot and loves to explore new topics, as well as exercise and play sports. He and his family like to travel in the desert areas in southern Israel and spend time near the Sea of Galilee. David is a talented 33-year-old actor who lived with his family in Nir Oz. He and his family woke up on the morning of October 7th to the sound of bombs and sought refuge in their home's bomb shelter. But when Hamas set fire to their house, the shelter filled with smoke and forced them out to meet the terrorists. His American family last saw him in a video shared by Hamas, where he can be seen in the back of a truck with Sharon and one of the twins. A survivor who was able to escape says she spoke briefly with him and that he said to her, "I know that I left the safe room with 2 babies and now I have only 1. I can only imagine what it must be like for him now to have both of his babies ripped away." These 2 families, these fathers, don't deserve to be separated from their families. They don't deserve to be kept in horrific conditions, potentially with little food. As joyful as it has been to see some of the hostages reunited with their families, we must not stop pushing for the release of all the remaining hostages. I will continue to work with our families and with the Biden administration to advocate for these individuals, and I will not rest until we get every hostage, including the 9 Americans, home. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
Senator from South Dakota.
are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Madam President, today I want to speak to the issue of our southern border because I think it's a really important and relevant issue with respect to the national security package that we're considering, or it will be, I think, at some point considering here in the Senate, that deals with many of the national security crises we face around the world. And as I think about this issue, I'm always reminded that, as a one generation removed from immigrant individual in this country, my grandfather came here back in 1906. I'm reminded that we are a nation of immigrants. We've had throughout our history a welcoming culture in this country. We are a country that's made up of people from all over the world, and I'm representative of that, as I said, one generation removed. It's also important to remember that we are a nation of laws, first and foremost. And Ronald Reagan once said, a nation without borders is not a nation. Or I've heard it paraphrased that a nation that can't control its borders can't control its destiny. And I believe that to be true, Madam President. And I think what we have right now at our southern border is a situation that's just run amok. It really has. You cannot defend, you cannot defend what is happening at our southern border if you believe we're a nation of laws, or for that matter, if you believe we're a nation of immigrants. Because you have to have a legal way to get into this country. All countries do that. And the United States, as I said, is a very welcoming nation. If you look at the number of people who come here every year as refugees, the number of people coming to this country, you add up all the other countries around the world, and the number of people that they allow into their countries, the United States exceeds that. And that, to me, is a remarkable testament to the welcoming nature of this country. But it's welcoming in the sense that it's done within the context of the rule of law. And that, first and foremost, has to be front and center as we think about this issue. And what we have right now at our southern border is essentially a huge welcome sign, a huge green light to come across our southern border and to do it illegally. And that is in direct contradiction and violation of everything that our nation is about as a nation of laws. And so, as I talk about this issue, Madam President, and we talk about it in the context of national security, it has become a national security issue because, once again, there's been another record set when it comes to the border, and not the good kind, I should say, of record. This administration now has, during the month of October, seen 240,980 individuals be apprehended attempting to illegally cross our southern border. That is the worst October on record, and that's on top of the three previous months, which were historic records. Month of September, 270,000 people apprehended at our southern border trying to come into the country illegally. So the highest October number ever recorded. And those are just the individuals, I would remind people, that were apprehended. The month of October saw an average of 1,000 gotaways per day, individuals that the Border Patrol saw but was unable to apprehend. That's another 30,000 people, unidentified individuals, entering our country in just 1 month. And there's no telling how many unknown gotaways there were during that same period. And Madam President, it suggests a situation at our southern border is completely and totally out of control. The closing of the fiscal year in September marked the third successive record-breaking year of illegal immigration at our southern border under the Biden administration. And as the October numbers point out, the end of this crisis is nowhere in sight. And if you think about it, the problems here are really too many to count. The men and women of the Border Patrol are under incredible strain and have been for pretty much the entirety of the Biden administration. Border cities are struggling to deal with the ceaseless influx of migrants, and major cities in other areas of the country are now discovering what border cities have been going through. And just as a point of fact, big cities, City of New York, the mayor of New York announced that he will be freezing the hiring of police officers in New York, closing libraries, and cutting education funding. This is in New York City to deal with the migrant crisis, absent an infusion of federal dollars coming in from Washington, D.C. So this is creating not problems just on our southern border, but for communities all across this country, including the largest communities in the United States of America. The situation we currently have in front of us is encouraging migrants to undertake the dangerous journey to our southern border, and sometimes with tragic results. And so I say, Madam President, that our national security is in jeopardy because a border security problem is a national security problem. And this isn't a matter of speculation. We know for a fact that dangerous individuals are attempting to make their way across our southern border every month. During fiscal year 2023, 169 individuals on the terrorist watch list were apprehended attempting to illegally cross our southern border. This is 2023, fiscal year 2023, 169 people on the terrorist watch list trying to come across our southern border. 18 in the month of September, another 13 in the month of October. Those are the people that are apprehended at the southern border. That doesn't count the gotaways. And my assumption is if they're on the terrorist watch list, they're going to be pretty good at evading the authorities, meaning that there are people trying to come into this country on a daily basis who are on the terrorist watch list. And on top of that, you have thousands of what they call special interest aliens, and those are individuals that may pose a threat to the United States that have been apprehended at our southern border over the past 2 years. Thousands of special interest aliens. And again, the numbers we have refer only to those who've been apprehended. As I said, last month alone, 30,000 identified individuals made their way illegally into our country. I should say unidentified individuals. In other words, the gotaways, the unknowns. Many of them may simply have been seeking a better life. That's entirely possible. But it's not only possible, but I would say likely, that some of them were dangerous individuals who should not be entering our country. Madam President, this work period, we expect to take up supplemental spending legislation to address national security priorities, notably support for our allies like Israel and Ukraine. And some national security priority, and one national security priority that this legislation must address, is border security. As the October 7th terrorist attack on Israel reminds us, national security requires constant vigilance. And our nation is simply not secure as long as we're dealing with a massive flow of illegal immigration at our southern border. We must get this crisis under control. Senators Graham, Langford, and Cotton have been working to craft a set of border security measures for inclusion in the National Security Supplemental, focused on the two areas in obvious need of reform: parole and asylum. Under our current asylum system, a large percentage of individuals claiming asylum are released into the interior of the country after initial screening, with court dates up to a decade later. The Associated Press reported that in March, 77% of individuals claiming asylum passed the initial screening. In practice, this means that thousands of individuals who've entered our country illegally and end up taking residence in our country, possibly for a number of years, given our immigration court backlog. That's a problem. And our parole system is in trouble as well. In fiscal year 2022, the Biden administration granted parole to 417,326 individuals. And that's because the Biden Department of Homeland Security has instituted an overly permissive application of parole, which means that, again, tens of thousands who have not been granted legal status and who may not have a case for remaining in the United States have been taking up residence in our country, with instructions to report back a year or more into the future for further review of their status. Now, given the backlog and overwhelmed nature of our parole system, this ends up being de facto permanent residence. And needless to say, this invites abuse. And individuals are availing themselves of these flawed policies to gain entry to our nation. And any supplemental legislation must not only deal with border security generally, but with our asylum and parole system specifically, if we want to get the crisis at our southern border under control. Madam President, our porous southern border is a massive national security vulnerability. Republicans know it, and while they may not always admit it, I think my Democrat colleagues know it as well. It's time for them to act on that knowledge and join Republicans to pass real border security measures as part of the National Security Supplemental. Madam President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Hawaii.
Thank you, Madam President. Before I begin my prepared remarks, I just want to acknowledge Leader Schumer for his extraordinary, personal, compelling, and essential remarks on the rise of anti-Semitism across the country and across the planet. It was needed, it was accurate, and it touched me. So thank you, Mr. Leader. Now, on a different topic. Madam President, we are about to see the beginning of COP28. That is the annual international meeting to take climate action. And this one is a little different because America finally took historic action on climate, and it is working. And so the message that America will be bringing to this COP28, which begins in Dubai tomorrow, is that we finally did it. We finally took the biggest climate action in human history. Is it enough? No. Is it more than we've ever done before? Absolutely. It's more than we've ever done before. And the COP is a unique opportunity for governments across the world to work together and coordinate their response to what is the greatest challenge of our time, the climate crisis. Climate change is getting worse by the year, and it's affecting more and more people in every corner of the planet, including all of us in the United States. Recognizing that, Congress took the biggest climate action in American history a year ago with the Inflation Reduction Act. In addition to setting targets to dramatically reduce carbon emissions in the United States, the IRA also made historic investments to accelerate the transition to a clean energy future. It was an ambitious piece of legislation, but the truth is the IRA's impact in just a year has surpassed even the most hopeful projections. And none of the parade of horribles that the fossil fuel industry articulated ended up happening. Prices did not go up for regular consumers, the economy didn't crash, and all of the things that, frankly, the clean energy side said was going to happen, and some of it, in my view, was aspirational, like hundreds of thousands of new union clean energy jobs, it actually is happening. So everything we said was going to happen, happened. None of the things that they were fearing would happen, did happen. And it's working faster and better and more powerfully than even our experts were able to project. But there is still more to come. The IRA is proof that big, bold climate action is not just possible, but it benefits everyone. And it offers a roadmap for the rest of the world. As my dear friend and family member, may she rest in peace, Madeleine Albright, always said, we are the indispensable nation. The United States is the indispensable nation. And I look at the presiding officer, and I think you know this. When we go abroad, it is a little shocking the extent to which people are hanging on tenterhooks, wondering what does the United States think? And you don't need to be the head of state for people to still be especially tuned in to what's the United States going to do, what are they going to say, what actions are they going to take. And finally, after the first COP where we organized, through President Obama's leadership, global climate action, and we had some momentum, and then we lost our momentum. Federal action on climate basically ground to a halt. So we were going to these COPs to say, hey, we're still in. We're still committed to climate action. Yes, it's true that we weren't able to do something this year or last year or the year before, but we're still in. And it was hard to make that case year over year over year as the indispensable nation while we try to tell everybody to take climate action, and we hadn't yet done it at the scale that was necessary. Well, this is different. Now we've done it. It's working. It is equal to the task in front of us, and every other nation should capitalize on this opportunity and do their own version of the Inflation Reduction Act. This is a real chance for us to put words into action. We've been talking about what to do about climate for years. It is time to finally put the resources and the money behind those pledges. as time runs out. What absolutely cannot happen in this conference is that it cannot be co-opted by fossil fuel interests. Too many oil and gas companies are paying lip service to addressing climate change, all the while actively expanding their fossil fuel enterprise. Just this week, we saw alarming reports that the host of the COP was looking to cut deals with countries on oil and gas projects. Now, I know that he denied that. I know that the reporting is somewhat mixed, and I don't begrudge UAE chairing this COP. It's a rotating COP. It goes by region. UAE gets to chair it. That's not the problem. The problem is the extent to which fossil energy companies, the American Chamber of Commerce, and other international corporations have decided to bear hug this process to undermine it. And we have to be very, very wary. If there are fossil companies or energy companies that are both on the clean and the fossil side that want to be constructively engaged in how to take climate action, that's great. But we will be damned if we allow these companies to bear hug the COP process to the point where it becomes meaningless. And so myself, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Cardin, Senator Heinrich, Senator Markey, and others will be watching this like a hawk. On another note, the Senate is about to vote on the first of two Hawaii nominees to the U.S. District Court, Micah Smith and Judge Shanlin Park. Both of them have had distinguished careers in law and public service and are extraordinarily qualified to serve as United States District Court judges. Micah Smith has been a federal prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney's Office for over a decade, most recently in the District of Hawaii, where he serves as Deputy Chief of the Criminal Division and Criminal Civil Rights Coordinator. Those who know him are quick to highlight his balanced temperament and deep commitment to equal justice. Likewise, Judge Shanlin Park spent 2 decades as a public defender giving voice to those most in need and has brought her integrity and sound judgment to the bench as a state court judge. Both of these nominees represent the very best of Hawaii and will represent all of us well on the judiciary, and I urge my colleagues to vote to confirm them both to the federal bench. They both had a bipartisan vote in the Judiciary Committee, and I'm looking forward to a bipartisan vote on the floor. I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Maine.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to speak for up to 15 minutes prior to the scheduled roll call vote.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I come to the floor to urge action on the fiscal year 2024 appropriations bills that fund critical programs that are so important to America and to American families. Programs ranging from biomedical research to our national defense. On November 1st, the Senate passed its first package of 3 appropriations bills: the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs legislation, the Agriculture and FDA bill, and the Transportation and Housing bill. And Madam President, due to the extraordinary work of the members of the Appropriations Committee, they passed by overwhelming bipartisan vote of 82 to 15. Despite the Appropriations Committee working hard to report all 12 of the funding bills by the end of July, additional full-year appropriation bills have not been brought to the Senate floor. Instead, the federal government has been operating under short-term funding patches known as continuing resolutions since the start of the fiscal year on October 1st. These temporary funding patches lead to harmful uncertainties, needless inefficiencies, and wasted taxpayer dollars. Madam President, one of the bills that I hope will be brought to the floor soon is the Department of Defense Appropriations Bill. This bill would provide critical resources for our military at a time when we are facing many complex threats from around the globe, including those posed by an imperialistic Russia, a hegemonic China, and an increasingly belligerent Iran and its proxies. Earlier this summer, the Senate Appropriations Committee approved its version of the defense funding bill by a strong bipartisan vote of 27-1. This bill contains funding for key national security priorities, including providing our troops and their families with the pay and benefits that they deserve, expanding our naval fleet and modernizing the nuclear triad, strengthening deterrence against China, our pacing threat, rebuilding our munitions stockpiles, and addressing military readiness and capability gaps. Each day that the Department of Defense operates under a temporary funding measure rather than its full-year appropriations bill, important national security investments remain on hold. For example, the department has identified more than 330 new programs or production increases that cannot proceed. This includes more than a dozen high-priority initiatives identified by the Air Force, $6 billion in Army transformation efforts, and multi-year procurement authority for the Virginia-class submarines. In a letter that was sent to the Appropriations Committee just today, Chairman C.Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, writes, quote, "We cannot outpace our pacing challenge while under a continuing resolution," end quote. In other words, Madam President, continuing resolutions give China the upper hand. I ask consent, unanimous consent, that the text of General Brown's letter be printed in the record following my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam President, recently some have called for simply passing a year-long continuing resolution for fiscal year 2024, essentially locking in last year's priorities, continuing to fund programs that should not be funded or should be reduced, and preventing the funding of new programs. I would like to take just a few moments to describe just how harmful that would be to our national defense. A year-long continuing resolution would simply fail to provide the resources needed to protect our nation. For fiscal year 2024, it would reduce defense spending by $26.6 billion relative to the President's budget request and the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and by $34.6 billion compared to the funding levels approved by the Appropriations Committee by that wide bipartisan vote. So you can see, Madam President, the big difference that having a year-long CR would lock in completely inadequate funding levels given the threats that we face. Many of the key national security priorities funded in the defense bill would suffer under a year-long continuing resolution. Let me give some specific examples. To respond to military recruitment challenges, the Senate committee-approved bill would invest in our men and women in uniform. It includes funding for the 5.2% military pay raise. As General Brown points out, a year-long CR would create a $5.8 billion shortfall in military personnel funding and exacerbate recruiting and retention challenges. To offset the cost of the pay raise for the military, DOD would be forced to slow recruiting, the last thing we want to see happen, delay service members' moves, and take other detrimental actions. So this chart compares our committee bill versus a year-long CR. And as you can see, there are tremendous differences in quality of life issues for our service members and the actual funding for the pay raise, which will go into effect, but the department would have to take money out of other personnel accounts. Other quality of life initiatives in the bill, such as expanding pre-kindergarten for more than 4,000 children of service members, and improving living conditions for sailors serving aboard ships, would not be able to proceed during a year-long CR. Our committee-passed bill also invests in the overdue modernization of all three legs of the nuclear triad. These efforts would be delayed under the year-long CR because of a nearly $3.4 billion funding shortfall. At a time when China's Navy is already at least 80 ships larger than our own, the committee-approved bill includes record investments, more than $33 billion in Navy shipbuilding. It includes funding for 2 destroyers and advanced procurement for a much-needed third. In recent days, the capabilities of these ships and the professionalism and expertise of the sailors who serve aboard them have been on full display as they have downed numerous drones and missiles headed toward them and aimed also at Israel. 2 of these ships, I am proud to say, the USS Carney and the USS Thomas Hudner, were built at Bath Iron Works in my state. Since October 7th, Iranian-backed proxies have launched at least 73 attacks on U.S. service members and bases. Our fleet is essential to protect those service members and bases, as well as Israel. The Senate committee-approved bill also includes funding for 2 Virginia-class submarines, 2 frigates, and a down payment on an amphibious ship, which is the Marine Corps' top unfunded priority. In addition to contributing to cost increases and delays in the delivery of ships to the Navy, a year-long CR would result in only 1 Virginia-class submarine, 1 frigate, and potentially no funding for the amphibious ship or the 3rd destroyer. General Brown points out in his letter that 30% of the funding in the Navy shipbuilding request could not be spent. The defense bill also includes more than $65 billion for capabilities or requirements related to the Indo-Pacific, including $857 million to meet the highest priorities of the most senior U.S. military commander in the region, and an additional $981 million for other unfunded requirements listed as priorities by our military services focused on deterring China. Our bill would authorize multi-year procurements for 7 munitions critical to the region, such as long-range precision missiles, Patriot air defense missiles, and anti-ship missiles. Multi-year procurements provide stability and predictability to our defense industrial base and save taxpayer dollars. Neither the additional funding nor the authority to award these contracts would be possible under a year-long CR. Our committee-passed bill would ramp up investments in the U.S. defense industrial base. It would increase munitions procurements funding by 31% compared to the last fiscal year, and includes $1.8 billion to modernize 23 Army depots, arsenals, and ammo plants across 17 states. Under a year-long CR, both of those initiatives would be blocked or delayed. Our committee-passed bill also includes readiness investments that would be put at risk under a year-long CR. Up to 75 Navy ship repair availabilities would be delayed or canceled, which would degrade the Navy's ability to deploy its fleet for operations, even as the Navy is maintaining a greater presence and projecting power in the Middle East since Hamas's terrorist attacks against Israel. And there was just yesterday a news story talking about the Department of Defense ordering an additional aircraft carrier strike group, air defenses, fighter jets, and hundreds of troops to the Middle East since the surprise terrorist attacks on Israel, in an effort to prevent that conflict from spiraling into a regional war. But the problem is that the military, because it has not received its regular appropriations bill, is having to scramble to find the funding for this. Because these Middle East troop movements weren't planned, the Pentagon has had to pull money from existing operations and maintenance accounts. And that means less money for training, exercises, and deployment that the military had already planned for this year. Madam President, our nation's security and our servicemen and women deserve better than a year-long continuing resolution. In the letter sent today, General Brown writes that beside passing a supplemental, the single greatest thing that Congress can do to enable the department to execute our strategy is to enact a full-year appropriation. Let's get our work done and pass the full-year funding bills. I urge my colleagues to work together. Let's meet the challenges our nation faces. Thank you, Madam President.
Clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Executive Calendar Number 379, Micah W.J. Smith of Hawaii to be United States District Judge for the District of Hawaii, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Micah W.J. Smith of Hawaii to be United States District Judge for the District of Hawaii shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun. Mrs. Brett, Mr. Brown, Mr. Budd, Ms. Butler, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggard, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Rono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young.